Well, welcome to Culturally Appropriate. I am obviously your host, Jared Hollyfield. We have a great show packed in today. First, we are going to talk to Caitlyn Schollmeier about her new company, Leela, which is a maternity wear company I profiled for the Pamphleteer in yesterday's edition. Next, we're going to talk about the new Nickelodeon show Quiet on Set, as well as Matt Walsh's new show for the Daily Wire, Judged, and sort of some general trends in reality TV and the ethics of reality TV that both of these shows touch on. And as always, we're going to end with our weekly film rundown. So let's go ahead and get started. I would like to introduce Caitlyn. So welcome to the show, Caitlyn. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So one of my favorite things about this job is learning about industries, learning about topics that I'm utterly unqualified to talk about beforehand. And your story really, really gripped me. I thought it's an amazing story of just sort of how you got to where you are with this company and this new brick and mortar store in Hendersonville. I knew nothing about maternity wear until I kind of started doing this. My wife had actually mentioned your products to me maybe like 4 months ago and was showing me the dress, but I didn't put two and two together. So before we actually get started with your story, could you tell us a little bit about Leela and what it is that you do?
Yeah, so Leela actually got started as an accident. It was never really intended to be, I was never intending to be a business owner, really. I had wanted to pursue a career in midwifery, which I'm still doing, but it kind of came just as a little bit of a surprise. I worked in OB pretty much my entire adult life. And then, when I was working as a birth doula, which is a person who, supports people through labor and birth, gives them, guidance and physical, emotional support. I had designed a birthing dress, so pretty much a dress that opens in all the places you need it to open in order for your medical team to give you, the care that you need, particularly when you're in the hospital. And so I designed that as an option for my clients. I gave the dresses to them, really only had a handful of them. And then when I was pregnant with my own twins, I had worn it when I was in the hospital and made a TikTok video that ended up going viral. And everybody wanted to know where I got this gown, and I didn't have anywhere to tell them because I had designed it myself. So I showed them the gown, and then that video went viral, and people told me I needed to start a company. So I, like I said, wasn't expecting to start a company. I wasn't really in the right position in life to start a company because me and my husband had just gotten kicked out of our rental house. We had, really nowhere to go at that time. It was the middle of COVID, and all of the landlords were kicking people out, or they were trying to sell their homes because the housing rates were going through the roof. So it was hard to find a place to rent. It was hard to find a place to buy. So we ended up just moving into a trailer, literally on the brink of having twins. So, we were like, well, should we invest all of our money into starting this random company? And we decided that we did, like we were going to, because it wasn't really an opportunity to pass up. So yeah, we invested all of our money into it. We set a launch date. Our twins ended up getting, they were supposed to be born early because they hadn't, there was some issues with their growth at that time. And so we ended up having them the day after, or the day before we were set to launch our store online. And it was just wild because I remember being in the NICU, and it was like I was trying to learn how to breastfeed and take care of these tiny little preemie twins, while my online store was blowing up. We ended up selling out of all the gowns that I had put up 2,500 gowns, and we sold out of all of them in 2 hours.
As I understand that for you, that's kind of like a tradition, right? Because before your brick and mortar opened, you also had your another baby, right? Was that it?
Well, yeah, so that was kind of like how we got started online. Was, it was my first pregnancy. And then now we are we just opened our first brick and mortar at the same time as having our third baby, second pregnancy, after our twins.
So you like doing milestones together instead of separately then?
Yeah, I like to just like live life on hard mode, I guess. I don't know.
So what just astounds me about your story is this idea that you make this video, this Snoop Dogg TikTok challenge, like just for your family friends, you use TikTok as editing. You go to bed, you wake up, and you've got 100,000 hits, and now I think your follower count is almost up to 1 million.
Mm-hmm.
What goes through your head when something like that happens?
I mean, like I said in our interview, I did not intend to ever be like an influencer. I never really liked social media a whole lot. Never really liked, I guess, what it stood for, or at least my perception of it. Like a lot of it was very artificial, and it just seemed like a lot of work to go and put your life on display like that. So I never really intended to be that. But at the same time, I was in this part of my life where I was like, okay, I didn't like everything that I saw in like the obstetrical world, like pregnancy and all the things that I saw as a birth doula. And I was like, well, I have this new audience, and I'm going to start this company. I was like, well, what can I do with it? Because I feel like it's too good of an opportunity to maybe spread some good information, like childbirth education, something that could help somebody. So I think I entered into the sort of influencer life for that reason, as like I've got a captive audience here, people who are pregnant. And then it kind of just took off from there. And I've gone through all sorts of different things on my page. I've shared, aspects of my life. I've shared childbirth education, obviously stuff about my company and my gown and what it looks like to be an entrepreneur. And I kind of, I don't know, I fell in love with it a little bit. I really enjoy it now.
Yeah. What really strikes me about your TikTok presence is a lot of times you'll see somebody on TikTok, they're just kind of like promoting a brand, or they're promoting themselves. And I felt like your TikTok is really a hybrid of obviously promoting what you're doing in the store and some of your other endeavors, but it's also a place like I learned a lot about practical business advice just going through some of these videos that you've posted. So what role does education play in what you do both online and in the store?
I think it's my main motivation for like a lot of my videos. Sometimes I post like funny videos, but even those ones are supposed to be a little bit educational. You can look through my funny videos and be like, well, what's the lesson to be learned here? And usually they have one. So I kind of try to interweave that into everything that I do online, because like I said, as somebody who never wanted to be like an influencer, I don't really see the point in being online unless I have something to offer, something to give back to the people who are watching. And the store is an extension of that. So, we had this giant open space. We remodeled it, put up a bunch of walls and made some rooms. And one of the rooms I definitely wanted to create was a childbirth classroom, because I don't really want it to just be a place to buy clothes. I want it to be a place where people can come and learn. Because right now in the Nashville community, there's not a whole lot of that. And a lot of that has to do with like the history of how hospitals and OBs and midwives have interacted over the years, the farm, and there's a lot of history there. And so there's not a lot of options for people to go somewhere where they can meet with other moms, where they can learn, where they can, access the resources that they need. There's not even really another maternity store like this one in like the whole Nashville area, the greater Nashville area.
Because I think like it's like a mother maternity outlet at Opry Mills and there's like one other shop that's by appointment only, and then as you said in our interview, Walmart and Target, and that's really it from what I understand.
Yeah, there's not a lot.
Yeah. So a lot of times it's coming up on graduation season, and people are giving practical advice about how like all roads lead to this current moment. And I feel like your story is really a story that serves as an example of that, because you've had all of these sort of disparate projects and occupations leading up to the creation of your business. And it seems like all of them informed what you're doing now and have really sort of allowed you to stand out in this industry. So could you tell us a little bit about some of the other endeavors that you started your career with and sort of how they contributed to where you are now?
Sure. I mean, I started out in the Air Force. I was a medic, and I got stationed. I mean, they station you wherever, they put you in whatever clinic that they want to put you in. So it's just by chance that I ended up in an OBGYN clinic, and I followed a midwife. And I think that was kind of the start for me, because I loved what she did. I loved how she cared for people and how clearly she, informed people. She kept people, in the know, never hid anything. And I decided when I was 18, I wanted to be a midwife. And then when I was moved to a new place in the military, I requested to be in labor and delivery. I became a nurse, and then worked a little bit in labor and delivery, and then went from there to go to college, worked as a doula, birth doula, while I was in college, because I really wanted to maintain that connection with people, and not lose any of the skills or education that I had learned in my experience working as a nurse and as a tech. And went from working as a birth doula to entering midwifery school at Vanderbilt, and kind of just continued on from there. And Just finished 2.5 years of education at Vanderbilt, and in the mix of this, I started my company. So it kind of all just like works really well together. And like you said, the reason I think that the design went viral and that people liked it so much is because it's made with the thought behind it of somebody who's been caring for people in that setting. We know where the openings need to be and what it needs to look like. And from the birth doula perspective, we know, how people feel best supported, and the psychology, I think, of going through labor as well. Because if you walk into the hospital and you're handed a hospital gown and you're hooked up to an IV pole, sitting in a hospital bed, you feel like a patient, and that affects your perception of pain. It affects just your overall birth experience in general. So it's kind of a perfect little blend of kind of practical and also, I don't know, supportive, comfortable.
And I absolutely, one of my favorite quotes that I've ever gotten from someone I've interviewed is where you're sort of describing this like crappy hospital gown that somebody just threw some flowers on. And that's what's supposed to pass as like, oh, this moment of life that is one of the major turning points. And that's what somebody's wearing, is this like kind of gross gown that just got some flowers kind of put on it in a pattern. When a lot of your work, you've been a little bit critical of just sort of the maternity health industry in general and that aspect of the medical field, because I know whenever you competed in pageants, which we'll talk about in a second, that was your platform, was that. So what do you see as some of the major problems of the healthcare industry in terms of maternity and OBGYNs that you're hoping to counteract with your business?
Oh, that's a very big question. There's a lot of little problems that kind of, come together to make a very big problem. Like we see the outcomes of it, and that the United States has one of the worst maternal mortality rates in the world, despite being a country that spends the most money on healthcare. And I think part of the reason is because we're a large country and we don't have a very well-connected medical system. I think a lot of people have lost a lot of their faith and trust in the medical system because maybe they've had experiences where they didn't feel like they were being well informed by things, or they were being, manipulated into, choosing certain things. And then there's just like a lot of, I think, butting of heads between different specialties. So, OBs and midwives, or midwives and anesthesiologists, or, all of those different players. And unfortunately, we need all of those different people in order to create a really wonderful healthcare system for expecting moms. So I think there's a lot, I think that's most of it, is those main things, the disconnectedness and the, kind of butting of heads. And also, patients feeling like they have not been well cared for, well informed, or have even been abused or violated in different ways.
So I was wondering, just for my own personal edification and for that of some of our listeners, as I'm kind of learning about this industry, as I'm thinking about family planning, starting to have a family, I get a little confused by the hierarchy of all of these different positions. So a doula versus a midwife versus a nurse that works in a maternity ward. So could you kind of maybe lay those out for us? When I think about a midwife, for instance, I think about almost like holistic natural medicine that's sort of opposed to the medical field. So when my wife was talking about going to a midwife at Vanderbilt, I was like, what? That doesn't make any sense to me. It's probably just my gross ignorance, but if you can help me out personally here with some of this terminology, I'm sure many of our viewers might be struggling with it as well.
It's very confusing, and you're not alone in that. I think the vast majority of people don't understand the difference, and that's also part of the problem, actually. So birth doulas don't have to have any formal education to really be a doula. Most of them do have a certification, but they're not very time intensive. You can become a doula over a weekend. They're not medical personnel. They don't provide any sort of medical care. They're just supportive. They can have, experience and whatnot and share information, but they should not be telling people what to do or giving them advice. And then you have a nurse who they're the ones that are providing a lot of like the boots on the ground care in the hospital setting, placing the IVs and running the medications and all of that. But they only do that under the direct supervision of a provider, which a provider in this setting could be either a certified nurse midwife or a doctor. There are different types of midwives, which is kind of what makes it so confusing. A certified nurse midwife is a nurse and they're an advanced practice nurse, kind of like a nurse anesthetist or nurse practitioner that you might go to and just see regularly instead of going to a doctor. A nurse midwife is in the same tier as that. They get a master's degree at minimum, oftentimes get doctoral or PhDs. But there are also other types of midwives. The other types of midwives can't always practice in every state. Some of them, like a lay midwife, for example, might not have any formal education at all. They might have gotten their education from shadowing another midwife, another lay midwife. So typically those ones experience the most restriction because there's no like accreditation, there's nothing like that. But a certified nurse midwife, those are probably the most common, the most likely ones to interact with because they exist in the hospital settings. They're the only ones that can exist in the hospital setting. And they are qualified to do most of the things that an OB can do, a physician, with the exception of things like forceps, vacuum deliveries, and surgery like cesareans.
Great. So it's really not as opposed. And something else I did not know, sort of going into this project and going into the interview and the profile of you, is that Tennessee is a really big hub for midwife culture.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, there's, like I said, a lot of history. So Ina May Gaskin was a very influential midwife who, from reading her book, she like led a caravan of like buses across the country and settled at the farm. So the farm in Tennessee is like I don't know a whole lot about it. I've never been there, but what I do know is that it's a bunch of midwives, mostly CPMs. I think only CPMs. I think they have one CNM, certified nurse midwife. But she's also a CPM, which is a certified professional midwife. So you're not going to find the certified professional midwives in the hospital setting. They only do things like home births or birth center births. But I think that's a big reason why, and it contributes, I think, to like the laws here being so that CPMs actually in the state of Tennessee, I think, have a little bit more freedom even than the CNMs, the certified nurse midwives. CNMs have to be, I guess, they have to be in collaboration with a physician, and I don't think CPMs need to be, but don't quote me on that. I'm not 100% sure.
So the other aspect that we haven't really talked about your history is the fact that in 2020, sort of in the middle of COVID, you entered this beauty pageant on a whim and then became, I think, the first winner at a pageant in the United States who was actually pregnant while winning a title. So can you talk a little bit about that experience and maybe sort of how that has influenced what you're doing with your business as well?
Yeah, it was an interesting experience because I kind of like with my business, didn't exactly anticipate doing it. I had competed as a teen in the Miss California Teen USA pageant, and then joined the military, got married, and then after I got married, I very much blamed my husband. I was like, "You're the reason I can't compete in Miss USA or Miss California, because when you're married, you can't compete in those pageants, but they do have Mrs. pageants." So I had competed in a Mrs. pageant because he was like, just do a Mrs. pageant. Like, stop blaming me. Like, just go after one of the Mrs. pageants. So I decided I would. And so I competed at the local level and won, and then competed at the state level. And really my big goal was to win a state pageant. Like, that's really all I was hoping to get out of it. So I won the state pageant early in my pregnancy, really before anybody knew, and then went on to the national level, very carefree, wasn't really, I didn't need to win the national level. And I think that's actually what helped me. I went into my interviews relaxed and just like was myself, and ended up winning at 5.5 months pregnant with my twins. And yeah, it had never happened before, not just in that pageant system, but just across the board. No one had ever won pregnant that we know of, or openly pregnant, I guess you could say. And so that was really neat because then I got to spend the next year, going through the process of having my twins as a first-time mom. And, I made videos about it, shared, me breastfeeding and my sash and all of that, and it got a lot of attention. And I think it's because a lot of people hadn't really seen themselves as moms in that space, and all of a sudden it kind of opened up this, I think, world for people. I had a lot of people reach out to me and say, like, I never considered competing in a pageant as a mom or competing pregnant, and then a bunch of people told me they were going to go and do it, which was
I guess that probably gives you a little bit of training for this like accidental influencer life that happened afterwards. So
a little bit, yeah. I mean, it was kind of all like at the same time. Like I won the pageant, and then, like I said, I was like 5.5 months pregnant, and then it was when I was in the hospital just a few months later that my videos went viral. So it was almost like, I don't know, it just all came together all at the same time.
So I went to the store a couple weeks ago, and I think it's great. One of my favorite things is, as we were doing our interview, people kept coming in and looking at the clothes because we've got a couple of the dresses, and I think we've got the website up that we've done up during our interview. But these do not look like what we would think of as maternity clothes. These look like very fashionable, and they are very fashionable and accessible clothes. And as my wife kind of told me as we were going through the process of writing, she's like, make sure to say that like this is not just maternity wear. This is like for that entire period of someone's life. So you've got the brick and mortar store now, and you had your grand opening, I think, over St. Patrick's Day weekend, and collaborated with a lot of international brands in the same field. So as you're starting the brick and mortar facet of your company, what are you looking forward to in the future in Hendersonville, where this particular shop is located?
I mean, like I said, I would like to branch out to, everything that has to do with this whole phase of life. So pregnancy, labor wear, as well as nursing, kids, all the supplies that you need, as well as the childbirth education and the classes and all of that. Like I want it to kind of be like a whole experience, to kind of allow people to, I don't know, like feel like they have like a support system there. That's my goal. And then maybe if it goes well, we can open up places in other parts of the country. I know people have already asked me for that. People are putting out their cities that they want one in, and then people will like it. So I know people maybe want that, but we have to see if this works first.
And what's been really striking about that particular development in Hendersonville was like 5-6 years ago. I mean, it was just kind of like rubber stamped. It was this like, lifestyle center, and there were just a lot of national chain stores. I think you're like in a space that used to be occupied by a Rack Room Shoes. But as I was walking around in preparation for the article while I was interviewing you, so many great shops that are just unique to Hendersonville have kind of popped up in some of these spaces. So it seems like it's a really kind of great place and a great hub. I know Ginger Bean is like right across the street from you all. And so how has that experience been sort of in this community space in Hendersonville for you so far?
I think it's been great. I really feel like the people who live in Hendersonville are some of the ones that can benefit the most. I feel like a lot of the population of Hendersonville is families. And so we've had a lot of people just pop in that didn't know that we were there, didn't plan on visiting us, but that saw it and came in. So I think that hopefully, we'll just grow and people will kind of see us as a staple of the community. I know that I've talked to the owners of Ginger Bean. People come in there all the time looking for a place that they can buy maternity clothes, and they just have to tell them to go to Target. So not anymore.
That's great. Well, so you're located in at 300 Indian Lake Boulevard, in the suites at the streets of Indian Lake. And those viewers who don't live close to Hendersonville can also visit your website. I think it's whereleela.com. We'll have that information up, and it's linked in the article that we published yesterday. So Caitlyn, thank you so much for joining us, and we really enjoyed chatting with you, and good luck with the future of this store. I'm sure that I will be in there soon. So
thank you so much. And thank you for having me again.
Of course. All right. So now we're going to turn our attention in a completely different direction. I've heard a lot of people talk about this new documentary on Investigation Discovery, Quiet on Set, The Dark Side of Kids TV, which has been streaming on HBO Max. And it's really become something all too rare, which is a water cooler show in this environment. I mean, we've really not had kind of this blockbuster TV show that everybody is talking about. And this week in the Pamphleteer, I write a little bit about sort of the ethics of reality TV and this idea of assumed authority. Who has the authority to tell a particular story? So The most shocking revelation from this series, which focuses on Nickelodeon from roughly 1995 to 2018, you see showrunner Dan Schneider, who founded the production company Schneider's Bakery. And Schneider is responsible, for those of you who haven't seen the show, for all of the kind of pioneering Nickelodeon shows that turned the network into what it is today. So if you think back to your time, if you're a millennial, all that was created by Dan Schneider. The Amanda Show with Amanda Bynes, Dan Schneider. iCarly, Drake and Josh, Sam and Cat, which is kind of one of the final big shows that he did. Zoe 101 with Britney Spears' sister, Jamie Lynn Spears. He was in charge. Victorious with Victoria Justice. He was in charge of all of these shows. And what the series does is it details some of the more unseemly elements of Dan Schneider's reign at Nickelodeon. Dan Schneider was known as a very toxic boss, as kind of a tyrant. And the show features interviews with a lot of the cast members of all of that and a couple of culture writers and journalists, in addition to kind of the main event of this show, which is the revelation that Drake Bell, who appears in a substantial portion of episodes 2 and 3, as well as the final kind of look back show, that he was sexually assaulted for years by Nickelodeon dialogue coach and all that cast member, Brian Peck, who, as the series details, which none of this stuff was known before the show came out, that Peck basically wormed his way into his life, became this father figure, and spent years taking Drake Bell to auditions and sexually assaulting him in a horrendous amount of ways. And at the time, his identity was kept secret, but even after these allegations took place, and this wasn't the only pedophile, within like a year span, there were 3 people who were accused of child endangerment and pedophilia at Nickelodeon, working on all that, working on these Dan Schneider shows, that even at the trial, at the sentencing, a bunch of Hollywood luminaries at the time, like James Marsden from the X-Men movies and Sonic the Hedgehog and a lot of romantic comedies, or several cast members of Boy Meets World, and Alan Thicke from Growing Pains and Joanna Kearns from Growing Pains, were all writing letters on this guy's behalf that had been sealed for years up until this particular show came out. So this is kind of the lightning rod moment of the series. So there's definitely a lot of issues that the series brings up. You know, one of the main ones is that there is a loophole in the law that allows child predators, registered sex offenders, to work on a TV show as long as there are parents present everywhere. So freelancers, day players, there's not a lot of mandatory background checks outside of the main people working for a network. So the documentary does bring up some advocacy issues. But the problem with the documentary is that it is utterly sensationalistic, and it is about the exploitation of children while also being highly exploitative itself. I cringed whenever I saw the way that the series introduced Drake Bell. There's this sort of this build up to like, who was this kid that was sexually assaulted and molested? And then suddenly Drake Bell comes out of the shadows and the second episode ends and it begins with Drake Bell talking about what happened to him. Now, obviously someone like Drake Bell deserves a forum to talk about this issue that had really been kept out of the media. But there are a lot of problems with the way it's handled. You know, this show is supposedly there to educate, but it really is set up as entertainment. So we are watching a victim of sexual assault for our own entertainment, which is a major issue. One of the other major issues of the show is that it makes all of these sort of giant leaps about this particular incident at Nickelodeon and sort of treats it as an exception, when in truth, this is a documentary that could have really been made about any TV show 30 years ago. So much of the evidence in this particular documentary is people looking at 30, 20-year-old clips from a show and saying they were inappropriate. So yeah, I mean, everybody has that experience, right? We watch a movie, 2008, we watch Iron Man, and we say, hey, those jokes might not play as well today because it's later in time. It's kind of a very obvious thing. So much of the documentary relies on that kind of rhetoric, and it relies on the fact that Schneider was a mean and abusive boss. Well, that's not something that was uncommon. I mean, this documentary could have been made, with few exceptions, just about any TV show that was released in any period before 2017. There was a book written in 2015 called Difficult Men that I mentioned in the article that I published about this particular documentary series. And Difficult Men traces the rise of prestige television. So it follows creators like Buffy the Vampire Slayer's Joss Whedon, David Chase, creator of The Sopranos, Matthew Weiner, the creator of Mad Men, Vince Gilligan, who created Breaking Bad. And it talks about sort of these tyrannical sets that they ran, tyrannical writers' rooms. But at the end of the day, these were some of the most amazing, impressive artistic shows on the air. And I don't think that it's a coincidence that sort of after all of these figures have been toppled in the wake of Me Too and in the wake of a lot of other allegations about how they handled their staffs in their writing room, television's not been the same. And we've not had a show in the last decade that's come anywhere near close to Sopranos, Mad Men, Breaking Bad. Nothing in children's television has come close to what Dan Schneider's done. In fact, a lot of the bigger TV shows that have been coming out since then, since Dan Schneider parted ways in 2018 in the wake of Me Too with Nickelodeon, have been based on Dan Schneider properties. So the reboot of iCarly for Paramount Plus, for instance, or Good Burger 2, the sequel. The other thing is that so much of the testimony, so much of the evidence in the particular show is provided by sources that are a little dubious. So while the experiences that these people are talking about in the shows can't necessarily be counteracted, that we have to take those with seriousness and actually think about what they're saying, motivations are a little murky from a lot of people. So the only cast member of any real renown that the series talks to is Drake Bell. And Drake Bell had a lot of incentive to appear on this program. He declared bankruptcy in 2015. He had his own bout with the law in 2021. He was arrested for child endangerment charges. He's been in and out of rehab for substance abuse. So, there was a lot for Drake Bell to get out of being on a show like this, even though it was very brave for him to come forward, even though this was part of his healing process. And hopefully he'll be able to move on from this and sort of reestablish his footing and deal with the trauma that this sexual abuse has caused him. But everyone else that we know of that has come out of this show and established a career, so Kenan Thompson from SNL, Ariana Grande, they have either just completely ignored the show or said that, these experiences didn't jibe with theirs. And even Drake Bell said that the only person who supported him that knew about these allegations was Dan Schneider, who everyone else is talking about. So while I'm sure it's true that Dan Schneider had some contentious relationships with some of these actors, we have to wonder why this wasn't a wide situation, why this wasn't everybody coming back and piling on Dan Schneider. We don't have Miranda Cosgrove saying bad things about Dan Schneider. We don't have Kenan Thompson saying the bad things about Dan Schneider or Ariana Grande. We do know that Jeanette McCurdy in her memoir, I'm Glad My Mom Died, which is an amazing, amazing book from 2022, she does make some references to Schneider. But it seems like these interviews, there was no real attempt to give an even-handed portrait. I was actually shocked, as a friend of mine said, that they kept the stuff in about Drake Bell praising the way that Dan Schneider handled what happened to him whenever that actually came out. So, all of this is kind of a major problem with the show. Another major problem with the show is that this is on Max, which is owned by Warner Brothers. So it's essentially a documentary that is taking down a rival, Paramount's wing of its children's programming and throwing a lot of shade, throwing a lot of doubt on the ethics of that particular station. So Max tends to benefit if, suddenly there's a Nickelodeon boycott or a Paramount boycott because of the show, or it helps Warner Brothers if Nickelodeon gets taken down a rung. And that's not something that's actually really dealt with in the show. Another major problem with this particular show is that it really does let the viewer off the hook for consuming this content. And it really downplays the idea of stage mothers and stage parents and how they interact with their kids' career. We have some stage parents. Drake Bell's dad is kind of portrayed as a very concerned figure in the show, and very much seems to be the case. We have other parents who talk and say they stepped in whenever things they thought were inappropriate were happening on the show or as part of the content of the show. But anyone that's worked in the film industry even a little bit knows that whenever you're auditioning a kid for a project, you're really auditioning the parent. I can think about one of my first jobs in the film industry where there was a fairly prominent couple of kids in show business, and their parent was gunning to play a stripper in this movie. And it was just this very kind of weird experience. I remember in my 20s, kind of in college on this film set, seeing something doesn't seem right about this. It just seems a little bit weird. And that's something that's almost completely glossed over in the documentary. Dan Schneider and the way that he runs his business is made out to be the enemy. And there's nothing else. He's the villain of this. This is not something. He's hiring these pedophiles. He's hiring these people to wreak havoc on these children's lives. And he's kind of if we take him out, none of this will ever be a problem again, is kind of the underlying message of the documentary. One of the other problems with the documentary is that it relies largely on third parties, culture reporters, including a writer from BuzzFeed, to kind of give their hot takes about what was going on at Nickelodeon. Now, one reporter actually worked for Business Insider and did some real journalism, unsealed these letters and exposed the identities of the people who wrote on the behalf of pedophile Brian Peck whenever he was brought up on charges and arrested and found guilty of the abuse with Drake Bell. But the other issue that comes with that is that there's not a lot of authority. There's a kind of this sense of assumed authority that happens whenever these people who are not necessarily qualified to be making these assessments or just kind of giving their own opinions are the ones that are threading the narratives together. So, for example, there's this weird contradiction that emerges that Dan Schneider is racist and sexist, but then even the people that are making these accusations admit that Dan Schneider also is responsible for this very pioneering portrayal of women with The Amanda Show, where an actor like Amanda Bynes is allowed to be loved and adored and be made a star by her personality, as opposed to her innocence, or as opposed to, her kind of the siren mentality that often greets women whenever they're portrayed in the film industry. So Amanda Bynes was someone that broke this dichotomy. Dan Schneider is somebody that's responsible for bringing this show, but he does not get the credit for that. He gets the credit for behaving in a way that we now know was outmoded and gets demonized for that. So, the accusations that Dan Schneider is anti-feminist or Dan Schneider hates women is that he made a comment that women weren't funny, even though his claim to fame was built on an incredibly funny young woman. The other issue are allegations of racism, and Dan Schneider says, Keenan and Kel, Good Burger, the first actors that really broke out of all that were African American, which the show kind of dismisses, but it doesn't actually engage with. So this is a show that has a point of view. In fact, Christy Carlson Romano, the lead actress in the Disney show Even Stevens, said that she wanted no part of it and wouldn't watch it because of the fact that it's what she called trauma porn. And we see a lot of that, especially in this self-congratulatory last episode hosted by Sold Out O'Brien. Sold Out O'Brien starts this final episode with all these people on TikTok raging about Nickelodeon who definitely have no authority, just the average viewer who are talking about the evils of Nickelodeon. And then she re-interviews Drake Bell, and then she admonishes the media for not covering this story in 2003, even though she was hosting CNN's morning show and had the resources to properly investigate what was going on and didn't do it. She kind of says the media was terrible at this time, but hey, I'm not responsible for that. I'm just the one making the criticism. And, we have other cast members coming forward and revisited cast members. So much of the show is emotionally manipulated. So much of the show really does exploit people like Drake Bell, who are victims, and they don't really get into the contradictions of that. So in a lot of ways, this can be a very detrimental form of reality television. We don't want to construe this as journalism. We don't want to construe this as a documentary. It is entertainment. It is, Christy Carlson Romano said, trauma porn in so many ways. Now, as I was looking for an antidote to this, Matt Walsh's new Daily Wire show, Judge, was not the first thing that came to mind. And for those of you who don't watch Daily Wire Plus, which is the subscription-only service of the conservative site Daily Wire, Matt Walsh, who's a cultural commentator, has got this new Judge Judy, Judge Joe Brown style show where he goes in and he adjudicates petty disputes. I don't really understand the legality of that, but apparently the Daily Wire has actually allowed him to have this role as a mediator or arbitrator, and these are like legally binding decisions whenever the people come in. So it's a reality TV show, but it's also not, because it's written and it's making fun of the courtroom drama. So you have these kind of hilarious moments where the bailiff suddenly starts speaking Korean in an episode where these two women are suing each other because one of them bought lip injectors from Korea and took them, and then as she was in a plane, her lips exploded. So there's these kind of funny moments. Matt Walsh, though, what's interesting about this is most of the time when we're watching a reality TV show, the people in front of the camera, they're trying to convince us their authority. So you think about the BuzzFeed writers and all of these journalists that are in Quiet on Set, or some of these actors who don't have the same high profile as Drake Bell. They're trying to show us their authority. And Matt Walsh is just kind of like laughing this off. He's making, very clear that he doesn't have any authority. So he's kind of sending up this entire notion of what passes for reality TV these days. The show is a courtroom show. It's funnier than most courtroom shows. Matt Walsh sometimes crosses the line a little bit in this show. I cringed a little bit whenever he was kind of making fun of these women who had these, large lips because of these injections. It was a little bit ungentlemanly, to be charitable. But at the same time, the show really does kind of provide an anecdote to this programming where people are, it's there for entertainment. They're enjoying watching these stories of people who were victims and inserting their opinions about it without any type of change, without looking at the broader context. Walsh is kind of inviting us to do that with this show. So, I would say check out Quiet on Set. I think rather than just sort of having this discussion about how evil Nickelodeon and Dan Schneider are, it might be good to talk about the ethics of the filmmaking and how the film is put together. And also check out Judged by Matt Walsh. I had quite a great time reviewing the pilot episode of that particular show. So I think Quiet on Set is streaming on HBO Max and running in reruns on ID. And then Judged is on Daily Wire Plus. If you have a subscription to Daily Wire Plus, you can watch that particular show there. And that brings us this week to our weekly film rundown. It's a pretty light week. Summer movie season doesn't get started for a couple more weeks, but we do have a lot of really great releases on tap. My pick for the week, and I actually saw this movie last night, is the Zellner Brothers' Sasquatch Sunset. And you might have heard a little bit of the buzz around this movie. It focuses on a quartet of Sasquatches in present-day Pacific Northwest forest area. And there's no dialogue, there's just grunts. And two of these Sasquatches are played by major Hollywood actors, Jesse Eisenberg and Riley Keough, who is Elvis's granddaughter and has had a really nice career for herself in shows like Daisy Jones and the Six and movies like Zola. And the movie's about a lot of things. I'm probably going to be reviewing it here in the next couple of weeks. But it really does sort of ask us what it means to be a narrative. It asks us about survival. It is funny. It's hilarious. It's gross. It really is like nothing I've ever seen. But at the same time, it is asking these bigger questions. What relationships do humans have with the past? How elevated are we really? So definitely check this movie out. It's playing at Regal Green Hills, Regal Hollywood 27, and AMC Thoroughbred 20. Another major release this week is the horror movie Abigail, which is based on Dracula's daughter. It's part of the Universal Monster series. And it's basically the story of a bunch of kidnappers who go after a little girl, as you see here in the trailer, and come to find out the little girl is a vampire. So something more nefarious might have been going on. The movie stars Melissa Barrera, who recently got into a little bit of trouble with her commentary on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Stars Catherine Newton, Dan Stevens, and essentially it's a horror movie from the team Radio Silence, who are responsible for the 2019 film Ready or Not and the two most recent Scream movies. So this film looks like it's going to be a lot of fun. The reviews have been really good, and I'm very excited to see this one as well. The other major release this week is Guy Ritchie's The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. And this movie is kind of like an Inglourious Bastards. It's in the vein of that movie anyway. But the really cool thing about this film, which I was reading about, is that it's actually based on a true story. These documents were finally declassified by the British government in 2022, and Guy Ritchie made this story on it. It's got Henry Cavill in it, Henry Goulding, Cary Elwes, as you see there. This movie looks like it's going to be a riot. I've heard a lot of people talk about it. Look for it to be a much bigger hit than what people are thinking right now, because I've heard just a lot of buzz about it from average moviegoers, just going around and talking to people or hearing people comment on the poster at various screenings that I'm at during the week. So this is one of the other major releases. We've also got a lot of great offerings from the Belcourt this week. Movie I'm looking forward to seeing is The Beast with Léa Seydoux and Dasha Nekrasova. And this is a movie about AI that thinks emotions are a threat. It took a while for this one to get a theatrical release. It premiered last year, but it's looks by all accounts to be this wonderful dystopian movie. So I'm going to definitely be checking it out. I'll also be checking out The Tuba Thieves, which is a movie made by a hard of hearing filmmaker about a rash of instrument thefts in Southern California. And it looks like it's going to be kind of looking into the questions of, what is sound? What is the nature of sound? I've heard the sound design for this movie is incredible. So this is one that I'm looking forward to as well. We also, for the stoners in the audience, have a screening tomorrow of Richard Linklater's Dazed and Confused. So that's a film that is going to be heavy on the minds of people on 420, and you're a lot better off seeing this one than the Bob Marley movie, I'm sure. But it's a Belcourt staff pick. It'll be playing tomorrow. And those are the main movies that are coming out this week. For the full weekly film rundown, you can check out the Pamphleteers edition today. So I've got this. I think there are 15 movies total opening up in the Nashville area this week. So you'll be able to check all of those out, get a full list of where they're playing, links to the trailers and all of that in our newsletter this morning. And that ends our weekly film rundown as well as the show for today. So whatever you get up to this weekend, give it some thought, and we'll be back next week. Have a good one.